They say a gunsmith's hands are everything. But Augusta Riley only had one. The other was gone, taken by a faulty hammer spring when she was 12. Folks said she'd never hold a rifle again, let alone fix one. But they didn't know Gus. She didn't rebuild her hand. She rebuilt the damn gun. Now, in the dead heart of a Dakota winter, someone's stolen the Army's newest prototype rifle, one she helped design. And the only way to stop it from being turned on her country is for her to track it down, modify a counterweapon by herself, and go toe-to-toe with mercenaries twice her size and twice her firepower, in snow deeper than her knees, with one good hand. So here's my question to you. Would you trust a woman with half the hands, but twice the nerve? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, full of grit, snow, and guns that never miss, Gus Riley ain't done yet, and neither is the fight. The wind, a mournful singer across the Dakota plains, was the first thing Augusta Gus Riley truly noticed. It carried the scent of snow, a deep, ancient cold that promised to bite and hold on. It was a lonely sound for a lonely land, and Gus, stepping down from the frost-rimmed stagecoach, felt a familiar kinship with it. The late autumn sun was a pale disk, offering little warmth against the vista of rolling, dun-colored hills already surrendering to winter's siege. Fort Dakota huddled low, a collection of dark log buildings braced against the immensity of the sky, looking more like a temporary scar on the land than a permanent fixture of the U.S. Army. Gus pulled her worn wool coat tighter. Her left hand, gloved and capable, adjusted the satchel carrying the tools of her trade, a trade that had brought her to this desolate edge of the world. Her right arm ended just below the elbow, the cuff of her coat neatly pinned, the simple, steel-pronged appendage beneath it, a testament to a day-long past, a day of fire and screaming metal in her father's workshop. She'd been a girl then, barely tall enough to see over the workbench. She'd pushed her younger brother clear, a heartbeat before the unstable black powder experiment had erupted. The memory was a dull ache, like the phantom throb of fingers that were no longer there. It had shaped her, this loss, carving out a resilience that was as much a part of her as the calluses on her remaining hand. Captain Ethan Hayes watched her arrival from the narrow window of his office, a mug of lukewarm coffee forgotten in his grip. He'd read the dispatch. Riley, civilian specialist, Ordnance Bureau. He'd expected a man, burly and seasoned. What he saw was a woman, slender, with a quiet set to her jaw and eyes that seemed to absorb the harsh landscape without flinching. Then he saw the pinned sleeve, a flicker of something. Surprise. Then a carefully schooled neutrality crossed his face. A one-handed gunsmith for the most advanced and temperamental prototype rifles the Army possessed. His own hand, calloused from years of service, tightened around the mug. He was a fair man, not given to snap judgments, but the Dakota Territory was no place for sentiment or perceived limitations. These rifles were his responsibility, their safe passage through Sioux lands. A tinderbox waiting for a spark was paramount. He'd maintain a professional distance, observing. The air inside the fort was thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale sweat, and brewing coffee. Soldiers, bundled against the chill, eyed her with open curiosity as she was led to the small workshop assigned to her. It was little more than a shed, cold and smelling of grease and old iron. It ain't much. Ma'am, Corporal Evans, her escort, said apologetically. But Captain Hayes said to give you whatever you need. It'll do, Corporal, Gus replied, her voice low and even. She unstrapped her satchel, the 5 fingers of her left hand moving with practiced efficiency, a subtle, almost unconscious grace. It was a habit, that hypercompetence with her good hand, a quiet defiance against the whispers and stares she'd endured her whole life. Later that day, a young sergeant, brash and full of himself, swaggered by as she was meticulously laying out her specialized tools. "Heard they sent us a gunsmith," he drawled, eyes lingering on her right arm. "Didn't figure they'd only send half of one." Gus didn't look up. She continued to arrange a set of fine calibration screws, her touch precise. "Sergeant," she said, her voice soft, but carrying an edge that made him pause, "if you have concerns about the integrity of these prototypes, I suggest you take them up with Captain Hayes. Otherwise, I have work to do." The sergeant flushed, unused to such a calm dismissal from a civilian, a woman at that. He mumbled something under his breath and moved on. But Gus knew it wasn't the end of it. Men like him always needed to prove something. Captain Hayes found her there hours later, the weak lamplight casting long shadows as she hunched over the breech of a prototype rifle. The weapon was a marvel of engineering, designed for twice the standard range, with a revolutionary loading mechanism that promised a firing rate previously undreamt of. Its 50 caliber rounds capable of punching through seasoned buffalo hide at 500 yards. But it was also notoriously delicate, a hard knock, a jarring journey, and its intricate workings could be thrown out of alignment. Gus had fashioned a small, articulated clamp attached to her prosthetic, which she used to hold pieces steady while her left hand performed the more intricate tasks. She worked with an intense, focused stillness that impressed Ethan despite himself. He'd seen men with 2 good hands fumble with less complex machinery. "Everything satisfactory, Miss Riley?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Gus straightened, a faint smudge of oil on her cheek. "The rifles are sensitive. Captain, this climate, the journey they've yet to undertake, they'll need constant attention." She met his gaze directly. "But they are remarkable. The Ordnance Bureau seems to think so," Ethan said, a hint of dryness in his tone. "And they seem to think you're the one to keep them that way." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I understand their mechanisms, Captain, perhaps better than most." She had a way of securing even the smallest screw with her 5 fingers, a peculiar precision that seemed to make up for the 10 she lacked. It was as if all the sensation, all the skill of 2 hands, had been distilled into one. Days bled into weeks. The first snows arrived, soft at first, then harder, driven by a relentless wind that howled around the eaves of the fort like a hungry wolf. The world shrank to the confines of the stockade, the vast Dakota plains vanishing behind a swirling white curtain. Mail deliveries stopped. Supply lines were choked. The sense of isolation tightened, palpable as the biting cold. Gus worked tirelessly, her small workshop a haven of focused activity. She spoke little, but her quiet competence began to earn a grudging respect from some of the men. Ethan found himself making excuses to visit the workshop, ostensibly to check on the prototypes. He'd watch her work, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the deft movements of her left hand, the surprising strength in her slender frame. He saw not a half-made gunsmith, but a woman of extraordinary grit. They spoke of the rifles, of the encroaching winter, of the uneasy quiet from the Sioux. Their conversations were brief, functional, yet underneath, a thread of something else was being spun, a fragile awareness, a shared understanding of the precariousness of their situation. One evening, the wind was particularly fierce, rattling the shutters. Gus was meticulously cleaning a firing pin, her breath misting in the cold air of the workshop. This land, Ethan found himself saying, more to himself than to her, it tests everyone. Gus looked up, her gray eyes thoughtful. It does, but it also strips away what isn't essential. You find out what you're truly made of out here. He felt a surprising urge to know more about her, about the fire that had forged such resilience. You're a long way from wherever home is. Miss Riley, Home was a workshop much like this. "Captain," she said softly, a flicker of an old pain in her eyes, quickly shielded, full of steel and fire and the smell of possibility. Some possibilities just turn out differently than you expect. He sensed the deeper story, the unspoken loss that mirrored his own carefully guarded griefs, and a silent respect settled between them, warmer than the struggling stove in the corner. The attack came on a night when the snow fell so thickly it seemed to swallow sound itself. A white hell had descended, the wind a screaming banshee. Gus had been working late, a stubborn mechanism on the third prototype refusing to yield. She'd felt a prickle of unease all day, a tension in the air that the storm couldn't entirely account for. Then, chaos erupted. A strangled cry, quickly silenced. The flat crack of a rifle, shockingly close. Then another, and another. Shouts, guttural and unfamiliar, mingled with the panicked yells of the soldiers. Gus doused her lamp, her heart hammering against her ribs. Peering through a tiny crack in the workshop's shutters, she saw fleeting, nightmarish images, dark figures moving like wraiths through the blizzard, the orange flash of gunfire, men falling, mercenaries. She realized with a sickening lurch, their movements were too coordinated, too ruthless for a random raid. They knew the layout of the fort. They knew when to strike. A traitor! The thought was as cold as the ice forming on the window pane. She pressed herself against the rough-hewn logs, her good hand gripping a heavy wrench, the only weapon within reach. The sounds of fighting drew nearer, then receded slightly as the attackers moved towards the main barracks and, she suspected, the strongbox where the chief engineer, a nervous man named Abernathy, slept. The prototypes. They were after the prototypes. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The gunfire became sporadic, then died out altogether, replaced by the triumphant, brutal shouts of the attackers and the mournful howl of the wind. As if nature itself was grieving, she heard heavy footsteps, a dragging sound. Then, silence, vast and terrifying, broken only by the storm. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the swirling snow, Gus dared to move. The scene outside was one of carnage. Sentries lay where they had fallen, dark stains blossoming on the fresh snow. The door to the small building housing Abernathy and the other prototypes was splintered, hanging off its hinges. Captain Hayes was already there, his face a grim mask, his eyes burning with a cold fury she'd never seen. He knelt by a fallen soldier, his movements stiff with shock and rage. "They took Abernathy," he said, his voice raw, "and 3 of the rifles." He looked at Gus, his gaze sharp. "You were in your workshop." She nodded, her throat tight. I didn't see much, just shadows and gunfire." He surveyed the devastation. Then his eyes fell on a scattering of spent shell casings near the armory, different from their own. Gus moved towards them, her gaze drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. She picked one up with her gloved hand. It was a custom load. She recognized it instantly. Heavy-grained powder, a specific crimp. Her blood ran cold. She turned to Hayes, the brass casing suddenly heavy in her palm. "Captain," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet cutting through the frozen air. "These rounds? They're specifically calibrated for increased pressure." He looked at her, uncomprehending for a moment. "They'll only cycle reliably in a breech that's been minutely adjusted," she continued, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "To tolerances I set, on the rifles I've been working on, the ones they stole, and the one still in my workshop." His eyes locked onto hers, the implication dawning. The stolen ammunition was keyed to the stolen rifles. But more than that, to the unique, almost imperceptible modifications she had made. Someone knew not just about the rifles, but about her specific, intimate work with them. The frozen plain stretched out around them, indifferent to the human tragedy. and the cold hand of betrayal tightened its grip on Fort Dakota. Gus Riley, the woman with one hand, now held a terrible piece of the puzzle in the other, drawing her further into the heart of a storm far more dangerous than any blizzard. The silence that followed Gus's revelation was heavier than the snow-laden sky. Captain Hayes stared at the brass casing in her palm. Then his gaze lifted, locking with hers. The implications were stark, chilling. Not just stolen weapons, not just a kidnapped engineer, but a betrayal that ran deep, planned with an intimate knowledge of their defenses and, most disturbingly, of Gus's meticulous work. A traitor, Ethan breathed, the word a puff of white in the frigid air. His face, already grim, hardened into granite. The faint hope that this had been an opportunistic raid by some wandering band of outlaws evaporated like mist in the sun. This was calculated, vicious. Orders crackled over the telegraph line later that morning. Once a runner had battled through the snowdrifts to the nearest relay station. Major Willoughby, comfortable in his distant, warmer office, was unequivocal. Secure the prototype rifles. The engineer is expendable if necessary. The weapons are paramount. Ethan's jaw tightened as he read the flimsy paper. The cold cynicism of command, so far removed from the blood staining the snow outside his window. He crumpled the message in his fist. "We'll track them," he announced to his remaining NCOs, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "And we'll bring Abernathy back." The unspoken addition, and the rifles, hung in the air. Gus found him poring over maps in his office. The lines of strain etched deeper around his eyes. "Captain," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "Those rifles, they have a unique acoustic signature. The way I machined the firing chambers, they produce a specific resonance, an echo almost. When fired, fainter with distance, of course, but distinct. If we can get close enough, if the wind is right." He looked up, his eyes shadowed. "You're suggesting you can identify them by sound, and by the shell casings." She pressed on, laying another spent round on the map. "The ejector patterns, the firing pin indentations. Each rifle, especially these prototypes, will have near individual markings, like a signature. If they use them, they'll leave a trail only I can read clearly." Ethan considered her, the small, determined woman with the oil-smudged cheek and the unwavering gaze. He was down to a handful of able-bodied men he could trust. His best trackers were among the dead or wounded, and she, this civilian, understood the stolen weapons better than anyone alive. The thought of taking a woman, a one-handed woman, on such a dangerous pursuit went against every instinct. Yet, the cold logic was undeniable. "I'm not leaving you here, Miss Riley," he said finally, a muscle working in his jaw. "But you'll follow my orders. No exceptions." A faint nod was her only reply, but he saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Respect, perhaps, or simply the grim understanding of a shared, perilous path. The pursuit was brutal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of blinding white, treacherous drifts, and biting wind that clawed at any exposed skin. Gus, bundled in borrowed furs, rode a sturdy cavalry mount, her prosthetic occasionally used to steady herself, her good hand holding the reins with an easy competence that surprised some of the remaining soldiers. The dismissive sergeant from before, one Sergeant Miller, was notably absent, having reported to the infirmary with a sudden, violent illness just before the attack, a detail that now settled uneasily in Ethan's mind. Gus's eyes, accustomed to the minute details of metalwork, scanned the snow for more than just tracks. On the second day, examining a patch of disturbed snow near a frozen creek, she knelt. "They used a marking agent," she murmured. Picking up a fleck of something almost invisible, she brought it close to her nose. A specific blend of graphite and tallow to mark equipment in low light, or to differentiate items without obvious visual tags. The kind of grease Sergeant Miller requisitioned from stores last month, claiming it was for weatherproofing sensitive trigger mechanisms. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Miller, ambitious, always looking for an angle, and he'd had free access to the prototypes during their initial storage. Before Gus had begun her intensive work, the pieces were aligning with a grim precision. Their trail led them higher, towards a rugged pass that was notoriously unstable in winter. As they navigated a narrow ledge, a section of the snow-covered path ahead of them gave way with a sickening groan, plunging into the ravine below. One of the younger troopers, caught too close, cried out as his horse stumbled, barely scrambling back to safety himself. The animal lost to the churning snow and rock far beneath. An accident, one of the men muttered, his face pale. Gus examined the fracture line in the snow. Perhaps, she said, her voice low, or perhaps the snow was deliberately weakened. A man who knew this pass well would know its dangers. And Miller, she knew, had been on survey patrols in these very hills. The doubt, the suspicion, began to coil amongst the already frayed nerves of the small party. Later, as they made a cold camp in the lee of a rock outcropping, Gus meticulously charted their progress on a topographical map, using the locations of the few recovered shell casings, ejected far by the powerful prototypes, to triangulate the enemy's probable direction. She was like a scholar deciphering an ancient, deadly script. Ethan watched her, the firelight playing on her focused expression. He'd expected fragility, perhaps even a hindrance. Instead, he found a quiet, unyielding strength. He found himself thinking of his younger sister, Elara, born with a twisted spine, who had faced a world that saw only her misshapen form, not the keen mind and fierce spirit within. Elara hadn't survived the harshness of that judgment, nor the limitations of medicine in their youth. The memory was a raw wound, one he rarely touched. "My sister," he began, the words surprising himself, spoken into the quiet of the shared watch. Gus looked up, her pen still. She wasn't formed like others. People couldn't see past it. He paused, the admission costing him. "I swore I'd never be one of them, one of the blind ones." Gus's gaze was steady. "Understanding. Prejudice is a heavy burden. Captain, for those who carry it, and for those who are judged by it." A fragile truce settled between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared humanity in a world that was often anything but humane. His trust in her wasn't just professional anymore. It was becoming personal. The ambush, when it came, was terrifyingly swift. They were moving through a narrow, wooded valley, the snow muffling their approach. When the air exploded, the distinct, rapid bark of the stolen prototypes echoed from the ridge above. Impossibly fast, impossibly accurate. Men cried out. Horses screamed. The return fire from the posse's standard carbines seemed pitifully slow, inaccurate against the hail of .50 caliber rounds tearing through the trees. Ethan felt a searing pain in his left shoulder, a giant fist slamming into him, knocking him from his horse. He hit the snow hard, his vision blurring. Through the red haze, he saw one of his men, young Private Henderson, pinned down, his rifle jammed, a mercenary taking careful aim from above. Then Gus was there. She'd slid from her horse and was beside Henderson in an instant, her face pale but set. Ignoring the bullets whining past, she pulled a small, specialized tool from a pouch on her belt, a device she'd clearly made herself, designed for her one good hand and the prongs of her prosthetic. With movements that were astonishingly quick and precise, she cleared the rifle's jammed casing, slapped the bolt forward, and shoved it back into Henderson's hands. "Fire," she yelled, her voice cutting through the din. Henderson jolted into action, brought the rifle up, and fired, the mercenary on the ridge falling backward, Gus was already moving, dragging another wounded man towards the scant cover of a fallen log. Ethan, struggling to sit up, his shoulder a throbbing agony, watched her. She moved with a desperate, focused grace, not a gunsmith now, but a soldier, a survivor. The woman he had doubted, the half-made expert, was saving his men. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The firefight was short, brutal, and costly. The mercenaries, having delivered their bloody message and likely running low on their specialized ammunition, melted back into the wilderness. 2 of Ethan's men were dead, 3 more wounded, including himself. As the adrenaline ebbed, Gus knelt beside him, her expression a mixture of concern and grim efficiency. "We need to get this looked at, Captain." Her touch was surprisingly gentle as she examined the torn, bloody fabric of his coat. "Shrapnel, I think, not a clean bullet." He gritted his teeth against the pain. Where did they go? Gus was already looking at her map, at the scatter of fresh casings she'd spotted even amidst the chaos. Her finger traced a line through the mountain contours. "They're conserving ammunition now, using it tactically, and they're moving towards the old Kestrel range," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor he could see in her hand. "There are natural caves up there, used as supply caches during the earliest skirmishes with the Sioux, defensible, hidden." He looked at her, at the unwavering certainty in her eyes, the smear of gunpowder on her cheek that was now a badge of honor. The frozen plain had indeed stripped away everything but the essential. And Augusta Riley, he knew with a certainty that went bone deep, was essential. She was far more than the sum of her perceived parts. She was whole and strong, and right now, she was their only hope. The thin, biting air of the high Dakota country did little to cool the fever that now raged in Captain Hayes. By nightfall, after they'd made a wretched, exposed camp, he was shivering uncontrollably, his skin hot to the touch, his words disjointed. The shrapnel wound in his shoulder, crudely bandaged, was inflamed, angry red against his pallid skin. "Gus!" Her face etched with worry, worked with Private Henderson, who now looked at her with something akin to awe, to tend to him, brewing willow bark tea, a frontier remedy for pain and fever. "He's burning up." "Ma'am?" Henderson whispered, his young face tight with fear. The captain, their anchor, was adrift. Gus nodded, her gaze fixed on Ethan's flushed face. "We need to keep him warm, keep fluids in him, and we need a plan. Those mercenaries won't wait for us. The remaining soldiers, a handful of weary, frightened men, looked to her. There was no one else. Corporal Davies, the most senior man, left standing and relatively uninjured, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, Miss Riley, with the captain down, we press on," Gus stated, her voice low but carrying an undeniable authority born of the moment. "We know where they're headed. The Kestrel Caves." A hostile murmur rippled through the small group. Sergeant Peterson, a man whose skepticism had been a constant, abrasive presence, stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of outright defiance. "With all due respect, ma'am," he spat, making the honorific sound like a curse. "This is a military operation, not some damn sewing circle. We need a soldier leading, not a civilian, and certainly not one who's compromised." His gaze flicked insultingly to her right arm, then swept over her slighter frame. Another soldier, emboldened by Peterson's challenge, piped up, "She'll get us all killed. What does a woman know about field command, let alone one?" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Gus met Peterson's stare, her own unflinching. There was no anger in her eyes, only a weary, steely resolve. "Sergeant," she began, her voice dangerously quiet, "with all due respect, your soldier's work under traditional command has, thus far, led us to a captain incapacitated, several good men dead, our most advanced weaponry in enemy hands, and a traitor who walked right through your ranks. My compromised state, as you so delicately put it, hasn't prevented me from identifying how these weapons work, nor how to potentially counter them." She paused, letting her words hang in the frigid air. "Unless you have a superior understanding of resonant frequencies, alloy stress fractures in sub-zero conditions, and the enemy's psychological profile, I suggest you either contribute constructively or conserve your energy for keeping up." She turned her back on his sputtering indignation, retrieving a length of tempered spring steel and some milled components from her toolkit. While some men still exchanged mutinous glances, Gus was already modifying her mechanical hand, replacing the original screw-tightened grip with a lever-actuated system. The metallic clicks were sharp, decisive, a small assertion of her will against the overwhelming odds and the simmering resentment. "Our carbines are outranged," she said, addressing those willing to listen as she worked. "But the principles behind the prototypes, some can be adapted." She began to sketch on a piece of cured hide with a charred stick, her left hand a blur of motion. "If we modify the mainspring housing, add a secondary compression lever here, we can increase muzzle velocity." Private Miller, the same one who'd once called her a half-made gunsmith, now eyed her work with a mixture of fear and suspicion. "Tinkering with government property. Are we now?" "Ma'am?" he sneered, his earlier bravado returning in Peterson's shadow. "You think a few extra springs gonna turn these pea-shooters into cannons? Captain Hayes would never approve this without extensive testing." Gus didn't even glance at him. "Captain Hayes," she stated, her voice cutting, "would approve of any viable advantage that keeps his men alive and recovers those prototypes. Private. And these pea-shooters, as you call them, are what currently stand between us and enemies armed with weaponry you clearly don't comprehend. This isn't tinkering, it's applied physics designed to give us a fighting chance. If you'd rather face them with your current range limitations and a prayer, feel free to step aside. Henderson, Davis, gather the men who still possess the sense God gave a goose and can manage a file and a wrench." Her sharp retort, coupled with the undeniable logic, shamed some into silence, while Henderson and Davies quickly moved to her side, their earlier doubts replaced by a hesitant belief. Within hours, under Gus's direct, patient instruction, even the most skeptical were working on their weapons. Later that night, a flicker of orange on a distant ridge drew their attention. A campfire, their signaling, bold as brass. Henderson breathed. Gus studied it through Ethan's field glasses. "Too obvious," she murmured. "Too exposed." She consulted her blueprints. "The cold, their main cycling gear assembly. It's a diversion." Her eyes lit up. "They want to draw us in. But their greatest strength is also their Achilles heel." She began sketching again. A new, more complex device. Peterson, still smarting, scoffed loudly. "Sonic mines. What in God's name is that now? You expecting us to fight 'em with bloody noise?" "Ma'am, this is the Dakota Territory, not some professor's tea party in Boston." Gus finally turned, fixing him with a look that could have chipped ice. "Precisely, Sergeant. And because it's not a laboratory, and because we are outmanned and outgunned by conventional standards, we use the elements at hand, including the enemy's arrogance and the flaws in their stolen technology. Their rifles have a vulnerability, a flaw I intend to exploit with applied physics, not just an exchange of lead. If you have an alternative suggestion that leverages a nuanced understanding of metallurgy and acoustics to disable multiple advanced firearms simultaneously without a protracted firefight that would surely see more of us killed, I am, by all means, eager to hear it." She held his gaze. "Otherwise, save your breath. You'll need it for the cold march ahead, assuming you can keep pace." She even began assembling a crude sound recording device, a smoked disc rotated by a clockwork spring, hoping to capture the exact frequencies of the prototype gunfire. It was an innovation born of desperate necessity, a spark of genius in the frozen dark, and it left men like Peterson speechless, if still resentful. 2 days later, Ethan Hayes drifted back to consciousness. The fever had broken, leaving him weak but lucid. Corporal Davies recounted everything: Gus's decisive command, the carbine modifications, her theory about the diversion, and her audacious plan for the sonic mines. Ethan listened, his expression unreadable. When Davies finished, he pushed himself up, wincing. "Help me outside." Supported by Davies, he emerged. The men gathered. Gus stood slightly apart. Ethan's gaze swept over them, then settled on her. His voice, though weaker, was firm. "I've been briefed." He looked directly at Sergeant Peterson. "Miss Riley's assessment is astute. Her plans are unconventional." Peterson seized the opening. "Captain, begging your pardon." "Sir." "But she's still a civilian, taking orders from a woman, and one who—" "Well, sir, it's irregular. It undermines discipline." Ethan's eyes, though shadowed by illness, flashed with a cold fire that made Peterson take an involuntary step back. "Irregular. Sergeant," Ethan's voice was dangerously soft. "Losing half a dozen men, my chief engineer, and 3 prototype rifles to a traitor who waltzed through our command structure. That, Sergeant, is what I call irregular. Being ambushed and outgunned by weapons we created. That is catastrophically irregular. Miss Riley's mind, her solutions," his voice rose, "are the only path I see back to any semblance of order and success from this debacle." His gaze softened almost imperceptibly as it rested on Gus. There was respect there, profound and absolute, and a warmth that defied the biting wind. "We will proceed according to Miss Riley's strategy," Ethan declared, his voice ringing with renewed authority. "Her intellect is our sharpest weapon. She knows how to unmake what she helped to make. Every single one of you will extend her the same courtesy and obedience you would extend to me. That is a direct order. Question it again, and you will face court-martial for insubordination in a hostile territory. Are we clear?" A stunned silence, then a ragged chorus of "Yes, sir." Sergeant Peterson, his face pale, gave a stiff, grudging nod. Gus met Ethan's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The undercurrent of trust had surfaced, a powerful current now openly declared, reshaping the dynamics of their desperate band. She was not merely accepted, she was endorsed. Her brilliance their beacon in the encroaching darkness. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a "good" in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The blizzard hit them with the fury of a cornered beast as they approached the Kestrel Caves. Snow, driven horizontally by a shrieking wind, scoured the landscape, reducing visibility to mere feet. It was a maelstrom, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation that lay ahead. Ethan, pale but resolute, his arm in a makeshift sling, moved with a grim determination that mirrored Gus's own quiet intensity. Their depleted posse, now more a band of desperate loyalists than a formal military unit, huddled behind them. "The main cave entrance will be watched," Gus said, her voice nearly snatched away by the wind, as they crouched behind a snow-drifted outcrop overlooking the shadowy maw of the largest cave. "The sonic devices. We need to place them near any suspected firing positions inside, to maximize their effect when the shooting starts. We go in," Ethan stated, his gaze already fixed on the cave. "You and I. The others create a diversion if needed, but only on my signal. Or yours? If I'm—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Gus nodded, her modified mechanical hand checking the small, dense charges she'd painstakingly assembled. From scraps of metal and a pouch of fine iron filings, she'd also fashioned a crude smoke generator. "This might help," she said, showing it to Ethan. "If I can toss it near their primary air vent, it'll cloud the main chamber. Give us a few precious seconds." Under the cover of the storm's howl, they moved like ghosts. Gus, despite her slight frame, navigated the treacherous, snow-choked path with a mountaineer's surety. Ethan, favoring his wounded shoulder, followed, his Colt revolver clutched in his good hand. They found a narrow fissure higher up the cliff face, likely the air vent Gus had anticipated. With a practiced flick of her left wrist, she sent the small smoke device arcing into the opening. A moment later, a thin tendril of acrid smoke curled out. Then another, thicker one. Muffled shouts echoed from within the cave. "Now," Ethan rasped. They slipped into the main entrance, the storm's roar diminishing slightly, replaced by the damp chill of the cave and the acrid smell of their own smoke, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. The main cavern was larger than they'd expected, lit by a sputtering fire. Dark figures were moving in the haze, coughing, their attention drawn towards the back where the smoke was thickest. It was then that a shadow detached itself from a rock near the entrance. A guard they hadn't spotted, a startled yell, a gunshot, and the world exploded into chaos. Ethan shoved Gus towards cover, firing his Colt even as a searing pain ripped through his leg. Buckling him, he went down hard, his head cracking against a rock. "Gus," he choked out, trying to push himself up, but his leg was a useless, burning weight. Another shot whined past Gus's ear. She saw Ethan, prone, trying to drag himself behind a large stalagmite, his face contorted in agony. He was hit again, this time a glancing blow to his already injured shoulder, and he slumped, still conscious but clearly out of the immediate fight. Terror, cold and sharp, lanced through Gus, but there was no time for it. Two mercenaries, armed with the deadly prototypes, were advancing through the smoky haze, their forms demonic in the flickering firelight. She'd managed to prime one of her sonic charges before the guard had spotted them. With a desperate prayer, she hurled it towards the nearest prototype wielder. The device skittered across the uneven cave floor, just as the mercenary leveled his rifle. He inadvertently kicked the small metal disc. When he fired, the sonic charge, triggered by the rifle's own powerful discharge and the mercenary's heavy stomp, emitted a high-frequency shriek and a violent concussive pulse. The prototype seized with a grinding crunch, its mechanism frozen solid. The mercenary stared at it in disbelief for a fatal second before a bullet from Henderson, who had followed them against orders, caught him in the chest. The second prototype was turning towards Henderson. Gus, seeing her chance, scrambled from cover. As she ran, a bullet tore through the fleshy part of her calf, sending a shockwave of fire up her leg. She stumbled, but didn't fall. Adrenaline momentarily numbing the pain, she reached into her satchel, her fingers closing around a hardened steel rod, sharpened to a point, a tool she'd made for clearing deeply impacted rifle bores. The mercenary was fumbling with his weapon, momentarily distracted by the other's sudden demise. Gus launched herself forward, ignoring the searing agony in her leg, and with a desperate, precise thrust of her left hand, jammed the steel rod deep into a tiny, almost invisible access port near the prototype's trigger housing, a diagnostic slot only she and Abernathy knew existed, a direct line to the delicate firing regulators. There was a sharp crack, a puff of smoke from within the rifle, and it, too, went silent, irretrievably damaged. "Clever bitch," a voice snarled from deeper within the cave. Through the thinning smoke, she saw him, Sergeant Miller. The traitor! He had the third prototype cradled in his arms, and a terrified, gagged Abernathy held tight against him as a shield. Always knew you were too smart for your own good. Riley, Miller sneered, his face a mask of fury and greed. Poking your nose where it didn't belong. Shame about that hand, though. Makes you wonder what else you're not quite whole enough for. Gus's jaw tightened, but her voice was ice. It's never been about the hand. Miller, it's about the mind. Something you're clearly lacking if you thought you could control these. Oh, I control this one just fine, he retorted, pressing the rifle's muzzle against Abernathy's temple. And it's going to make me a very rich man. My employers pay well for innovation. He gestured vaguely. Rival arms company. They appreciated my initiative. There's no honor in betrayal, Miller, or in threatening an unarmed man. Gus's left hand, steady as the rock she leaned against, slowly raised her own modified carbine. Her leg throbbed, sending waves of nausea through her. But she locked it down. Her focus absolute. Miller laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. Honor. Look around you, sweetheart. This is about survival and profit. Something a cripple like you wouldn't understand. That was his mistake. The insult, meant to shatter her, instead focused her resolve into a diamond point. Her left index finger tightened on the trigger. It wasn't the dominant hand she'd lost as a child, but it was the hand that had learned a different kind of strength, a different kind of precision. She knew the exact spot on the prototype, a minute flaw she'd argued to correct in the design phase, a tiny section of the receiver casing that, if struck with enough force by a high-velocity round, could cause a catastrophic internal pressure spike. She fired. The carbine bucked in her grip, her modified prosthetic taking the recoil. The bullet, true to her aim, struck the prototype not with a clang, but with a peculiar, dull thud. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sickening, muffled roar, the prototype in Miller's hands seemed to convulse. It didn't explode outwards, but inwards. A violent, contained rupture. Miller screamed, a high, thin sound cut short as the mangled weapon. Its internal workings shattered, drove jagged metal back into his own body. He crumpled, dropping Abernathy, who scrambled away in terror. The firefight raged on around them. One of the posse, Private Collins, screamed as his carbine jammed, a mercenary bearing down on him. Gus, her leg screaming in protest, saw Ethan. He'd managed to prop himself against the stalagmite, his face a deathly white, but his Colt was steady in his hand. He laid down a surprisingly accurate covering fire, forcing the mercenary to duck, giving Gus the precious seconds she needed. "Collins, throw it here," she yelled. He tossed the jammed weapon. Even as bullets chipped at the rock around her, Gus's hands, one of flesh and blood, the other of steel and ingenuity, worked with astonishing speed. She cleared the spent casing, slammed the bolt home, and threw the rifle back. Go! The tide turned, with Miller down and two of the prototypes destroyed. The remaining mercenaries lost their nerve. Faced with the unexpectedly fierce resistance of the posse and the deadly precision of Gus's interventions, they began to fall back, only to be met by the rest of Ethan's men, who had finally charged the cave. The fight was over in minutes. The surviving mercenaries were disarmed, their faces a mixture of shock and defeat. Abernathy, though shaken, was alive. The last, damaged prototype was recovered. Silence descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the fading howl of the blizzard outside. Gus leaned heavily against the cave wall, the adrenaline finally deserting her, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the throbbing agony in her leg. Ethan, supported by Henderson, made his way towards her. His eyes, dark with pain, found hers. There were no words adequate for what had passed between them, for what they had endured. But in his gaze, she saw it all: respect, gratitude, and a profound, unshakable admiration that went deeper than words. He looked at her, then at her left hand, still holding the carbine, and then at the modified prosthetic. "Augusta," he said, his voice rough, using her full name for the first time. He reached out, his gloved fingers lightly touching her good shoulder. "You—" He shook his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips despite the pain. "You are truly remarkable." In the dim, smoky light of the Kestrel cave, surrounded by the detritus of battle, their shared glance spoke of survival, of a trust forged in the roaring fire of conflict, and the quiet promise of a dawn beyond the ice. The journey back from the Kestrel caves was a somber, arduous affair. The blizzard had blown itself out, leaving behind a world swathed in an unnerving, pristine silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath hooves and the low moans of the wounded. Gus, her leg tightly bandaged and throbbing with a dull fire, rode stoically, her gaze often drifting to Captain Hayes. He, too, was battered, his arm still in its sling, his face etched with pain and exhaustion, yet his eyes, when they met hers, held a new light, a profound respect that warmed her more than any campfire. They had faced the crucible together and emerged, not unscathed, but irrevocably changed. Weeks later, back at the somewhat restored Fort Dakota, official dispatches arrived from the Ordnance Bureau. There were commendations, of course. The recovery of the prototypes was deemed a significant success, the prevention of their falling into rival hands a matter of national security. Captain Hayes was lauded for his leadership in the face of extreme adversity. The reports detailed, with surprising accuracy given the initial chaos, the pivotal role played by the civilian specialist, Riley. A military council, however, convened to discuss formal honors, balked. Commendable actions, undoubtedly, read the summary forwarded to Hayes, but Miss Riley is not of the military. A public citation or medal would be unconventional, setting an unwelcome precedent. Ethan, his own leg now healing alongside his shoulder, read the dispatch in his office. Gus seated opposite him, a cup of lukewarm coffee in her good hand. A muscle worked in his jaw. Unwelcome precedent, he repeated, his voice laced with cold anger. They'd have welcomed a precedent of utter failure if not for you. He penned a terse reply, declining any personal decoration if Miss Augusta Riley's contributions were not formally and publicly acknowledged alongside his own. "Some fights," he said, looking at Gus, "are worth continuing, even off the battlefield." Gus offered a rare, faint smile. "Your support is more than enough recognition, Captain. As for public glory—" She shook her head. "It's not what I seek." Instead, she spent her final days at the fort meticulously documenting her findings and final design improvements for the prototype rifle. She included the plans for her sonic concussion device, her modifications for enhanced carbine range, and a detailed analysis of the prototype's critical flaw. Her last recommendation, penned in her neat, left-handed script, was pointed: the primary chamber locking mechanism should be redesigned for simplicity and robustness, utilizing standardized, easily replicable parts. The current iteration, while innovative, creates an unacceptable dependency on the singular expertise of its original fabricator or a similarly skilled individual. True advancement lies in reliable function accessible to many, not arcane complexity known to few. She added a separate addendum, a passion project sketched out during her own recovery, subtle modifications to the rifle's stock and loading mechanism, designed to improve balance and ease of use for an operator with only one functional hand. For anyone, she wrote beneath it, with one hand and enough determination before she was due to depart. Ethan approached her in the small workshop that had become her sanctuary and proving ground. He was no longer in a sling, though he still moved with a slight stiffness. In his hands, he carried one of the recovered prototype rifles, the one that had not been destroyed. It gleamed under his careful ministrations, restored to perfect working order, yet subtly different. "Augusta," he said, his voice holding a warmth that was now familiar, a comfort. "The Bureau may quibble over regulations, but some debts of honor are paid directly." He presented the rifle to her. It felt balanced in her grip, an extension of her will. Then she saw the inscription, finely etched into the polished walnut stock, just below the receiver. "Gus built this. Gus saved this." Her breath caught. Her fingers traced the cool, precise lettering. It wasn't just a rifle. It was a testament. A story of shared peril and mutual respect that transcended rank and regulation. "Ethan," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take it," he replied, his eyes meeting hers, holding a depth of understanding that needed no further words. "It belongs with you, a tool for a master artisan." He paused, and perhaps a reminder that even in the most desolate of places, remarkable things and remarkable people can be found. The air between them was charged, not with the tension of command or conflict, but with a quiet, profound connection, a romance written not in flowery prose, but in shared glances, deeds of courage, and the silent language of two souls who had seen the worst and brought out the best in each other. A lucrative offer came soon after, delivered by a slick representative from a large Eastern arms manufacturing company. Chief of Engineering, a salary that could make her wealthy beyond measure, a laboratory of her own. Gus listened politely, then declined. "But why, Miss Riley?" The man pressed, bewildered. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime." "My lifetime, sir," Gus replied, her gaze distant, fixed on the vast, beckoning horizon beyond the fort's walls, is headed in a different direction. She thought of the countless firearms in the hands of settlers, ranchers, and even soldiers across the sprawling West. Weapons prone to jamming, to misfiring, to catastrophic failure due to poor design or maintenance. Men and women whose lives depended on a tool that too often betrayed them. There are design flaws out there that need addressing, problems that need solving, not in a laboratory, but where the steel meets the dirt and the lives are real. The final scene unfolded some weeks later. Gus sat atop a westward-bound stagecoach, the Dakota Plains receding behind her like a half-forgotten dream. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant mountains. Her left hand rested on the smooth stock of the rifle Ethan had given her. Her rifle, into the side of the butt plate. She herself had carefully carved a tiny, almost invisible inscription, a personal mantra: one hand, one chance, enough. Her custom-made tools were neatly stowed in a leather roll beside her. Her mechanical right hand, now a familiar and efficient extension of her will, held a new set of blueprints, a design never before revealed, its purpose known only to her, hinting at innovations yet to come. As the stagecoach rumbled through a dusty, nascent settlement, a small girl stood by the side of the rutted track, watching them pass. One of her sleeves was empty, pinned neatly at the shoulder, just as Gus's once had been. The girl's eyes, wide and curious, met Gus's. For a fleeting second, a spark of unspoken understanding, of shared resilience, passed between them. A silent acknowledgement across generations and circumstances. Gus offered the barest hint of a nod, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The child's eyes widened further, a dawning realization, perhaps even a flicker of hope. The stagecoach rolled on, carrying Augusta Riley further into the heart of the West. She was a mender, a maker, an innovator, Her path was not one of fame or fortune, but of quiet purpose. Her singular skills dedicated to those who, like her, understood that sometimes one hand, one chance, when guided by an unyielding spirit and a keen mind, was indeed more than enough. The horizon ahead was vast, filled with challenge. But for Gus, it was also filled with possibility, a future she would shape with her own two hands, one of flesh, one of steel, both undeniably her own. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, the stagecoach pulled into a raw, burgeoning settlement named Redemption Gulch, a name that seemed to hang in the air with a question mark rather than a statement. Lanterns cast flickering pools of light onto muddy streets and the rough-hewn storefronts. Even before the coach fully stopped, a commotion was audible from the direction of the town's only smithy. A man's voice, raised in frustration, then a cry of pain. Gus, alighting from the coach to stretch her legs, felt that familiar pull, the scent of trouble, not of malice, but of mechanical failure, of desperation. Her new rifle, a comforting weight, remained slung across her back. She saw a small crowd gathered. A young man, clutching a bleeding hand, was being helped away from the smithy, while an older, stout man, the smith, presumably, swore at a complex piece of machinery that looked like a new type of hydraulic pump, now sputtering and leaking. Damn newfangled contraption, the smith roared, supposed to save labor, and it's near taken young Tim's fingers. Nobody here knows how to fix the blasted thing, and the nearest engineer is a week's ride away, if he even cares to come. Gus moved closer, her keen eyes already dissecting the pump's design, noting the flawed pressure seals, the imbalanced gearing, the unrevealed blueprint in her satchel, the one her mechanical hand had been guarding, depicted a series of modular, adaptable tools and mechanisms, not for weaponry, but for construction, for agriculture, for making life in these harsh lands a fraction easier, safer. Perhaps its first application was presenting itself sooner than she'd thought. She stepped forward, her shadow falling over the frustrated smith. Perhaps, Augusta Riley said, her voice calm amidst the small chaos. I could take a look. The smith, about to curse again, stopped short, taking in the quiet woman with the observant eyes, the pinned sleeve, and the capable set of her remaining hand. He saw the rifle, the well-used tool roll, and something in her steady gaze that spoke of competence. He hesitated, then grunted, "Can't make it worse. Ma'am, be my guest." Gus knelt, her left hand already reaching for her tools, her mind alight with the challenge. The West was indeed full of faulty designs, and not all of them were guns. Her journey was just beginning, and Redemption Gulch, it seemed, was ready for its first touch of true, compassionate invention. The future felt as vast and unwritten as the land stretching out beyond the lantern light, and Gus felt a quiet, profound readiness to meet it. Oh, so what do you think? Is Gus just chasing justice? Or something more personal? Would you trust a gunsmith with one hand if she was the only one who could save you? I want to hear your take. Drop your thoughts down in the comments. And if this story lit a fire under your boots, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. More grit, more guns, more guts. This ain't your usual Western, and we're just getting started.